Today we're gonna do something very special. Blizzard, yes, the Blizzard, you know, StarCraft, Warcraft, World of Warcraft, Overwatch, yeah, that Blizzard, reached out to ya boy to create a video featuring a character from their new expansion, The War Within. Originally, they were supposed to supply me with STLs of the characters, and while they did technically do that, are their eyes closed? I think we can do a little bit better. They let me pick from a list of characters, and I think I'm legally obligated to go with Xal'atath. I mean, how could I not? Not only is she the Harbinger of the Void. Yes, please. But she's also a purple lady. Apparently, I have a thing for purple people. Blizzard was very cool with me working with one of my sculptors to create a one-of-a-kind bust of this ancient entity, once bound to a blade, now free and occupying a deceased elf's body. What? Also, I get to essentially produce a figure for Blizzard. What? I worked with Layla for this project, an incredibly talented sculptor who I have worked with very recently on a different, exciting new model that I can't wait to show you guys. We began with this concept, and after several rounds of revisions, we ended up here, and I was ready to get painting. But first, I had to place some supports, print the model out with some failures, place more supports, and print it out one final time. With the model's supports removed, I had some cleanup to do, just like with any regular model. With the sponge sanding twig, I was able to remove the bulk of the remnant support tips. I like sanding twigs for this job as it conforms to the natural curves of the model, like her arms and back. There were a few cavities to fill in, which I did simply with super glue. Once it was cured, I removed the bulk of the glue with an X-Acto knife and then sanded the rest flush. With the model cleaned up, I washed it in the sink with soap and water to clean it up again. Because busts don't stand on their own, we'll need to attach Xal'atath to a plinth. With a pilot hole started with my X-Acto knife, I proceeded to drill larger and larger holes on the underside to accept a brass pin. Because 3D printed resin has a tendency to chip really easily, I find that going slowly and stepping up the drill bit size one after the other can help to get a nice clean result. I attach the model to a temporary wooden dowel for painting and will attach it to its final plinth when the model is finished. I began with a layer of black primer that I then highlighted with Tamiya flat white. This will give me a good idea where to put the highlights and shadows, but also give me a white undercoat in the areas where it matters, meaning my initial base coats will go on easier than if it were all black. Additionally, the deepest recesses stay dark, meaning if I miss a hard to reach area with my brush, it'll likely be black and hard to see. I've fully converted from white ink to Tamiya white, and I think you should too. Not only is it very matte, meaning your first layers of paint grip to it nicely, but also it doesn't reactivate with washes and contrast paint like ink has a tendency to do. I'll link it below in the description along with all the other tools that I also use. If you purchase a product using one of these affiliate links, I earn a little bit of extra cash at no expense to you. Thanks! I decided to re-explore a method of painting that I haven't done in a long while. I created a gradient on my wet palette with a deep violet hue and a light blue. The idea now is that I have access to virtually every color in between these two and can pick and choose while I base coat the model, which is what I did. With the help of some rough wet blending, a technique I discuss in more detail in a different video linked below, I began to block in my colors with the aid of my white and black undercoat. Where it's dark, I use the purpley shadow, and where it's light, I use the desaturated, cold lilac hue. Everywhere in between, I messily blend the two together. Eventually, I rediscovered why I no longer paint in this way, and that's because it's kind of annoying. For a big model like this, you need a large amount of paint to base coat, and with this method, you don't really get that. You get a lot of paint spread out very thinly on your palette, which is fine if you're painting a small part or a smaller model, but for the skin of Xal'atath, it wasn't cutting it. I reverted to individual mixes for the colors that I needed, which is what I do nowadays on most miniatures. I was excited to paint her face, so that's where I started to really refine the work of my initial blends. If you're curious about where I'm placing my highlights and shadows, I take a ton of inspiration from makeup tutorials. Xal'atath is probably pretty mean with a contour brush, considering she's possessed a literal corpse and still looks 10 out of 10. I actually did a deep dive on the subject of makeup and face painting, which resulted in me competing against my wife to see who could apply makeup better. Spoilers, I looked fabulous. If you want to see that video, it's linked below. Tons of great face painting tips. I watched the makeup tutorials, so you don't have to. Speaking of faces, Xal'atath seems to be the villainous face of this new World of Warcraft expansion, aiding an ancient Nerubian civilization in their rise to power.
The time is now.
This expansion is the first of 3 planned, which will celebrate narratively the legacy of World of Warcraft. She reminds me a lot of Sylvanas Windrunner, one of my favorite characters from the franchise who I first met playing Warcraft 3, The Frozen Throne. Believe it or not, this t-shirt that I'm wearing right now is actually from that same time period when I was in 4th grade, 20 years ago. How it still fits me is completely a mystery, but I'm happy to still have it. Xal'atath has eyes like deep galactic pools, and I was excited to give it a shot. I started with a very dark, rich violet color, the same one that we used on the face. I then painted in an iris with magenta, a warmer purple, hoping that it would stand out from the dark and cold violet. Remember when painting irises to not paint a full circle. You want a portion of the iris covered by the eyelid for a more relaxed and natural look. Then I painted the bottom of the iris with a teal and filled in the iris to form a pupil. Lastly, I painted the very bottom of this ring color with a very bright cold white, and I think we're nailing it. To further accent these eyes, I added some bluish purple eyeshadow to the lower and upper lids. I was inspired by some of the character art when making this choice. I'm never disappointed by adding eyeshadow to my minis. It can be a little bit scary because often the upper cheek and brow area is where we have our brightest highlights, so darkening them down can feel a little counterintuitive. The trick is to limit your shading efforts to just the lower and upper lid and the forehead below the eyebrow. Stick to these regions and you'll be golden. I then moved on to doing Xal'atath's face markings, which I started by tracing in a light color to make sure that I could achieve the small symbols, and once I was confident, I used a darker color to fill in the outline. It's much easier to fix mistakes made by a light color than a darker one. Whenever doing things like this, you'll likely mess up in small ways. I was able to correct those issues with a slight edge highlight below the markings. This allowed me to true up any lines that were goofy, and it also makes the markings look recessed, like tribal scarring. I'm not sure if that's exactly lore accurate, but what it is awesome. I tried to do the marking in the middle of her forehead a couple of times, but it kept turning out like a smiley face, so I just gave up. Once I felt like the face was done, I blocked in all the hair and extraneous details with a dark color so I could get a sense for the complete face, and it was looking good, so I moved on. I picked a warm and dark purple color for the hair to frame the cold purple of the face. I used the same off-white blue color to mix my highlights with the hair color, however. I like to do that as I feel like it harmonizes the 2 different parts of the model when they share a highlight or a shadow color. I focused my highlights in a ring around the hair, like a frosty crown. Much like the skin, I began with a sloppy wet blend to get 80% of my color in the right spot quickly. At this stage, I'm not thinking about individual strands of hair. I'm treating the whole head of hair as one piece, going so far as to even glaze some colors on the very top of the head and elsewhere to refine this sketch. Once I was happy, I began to recess shade the individual strands of hair that Layla sculpted onto the model. I'm always so blown away by how much of a difference this step makes. Take a look at this side-by-side comparison. I do no extra blending on the right-hand side. A nice thin line of separation visually cleans up so much. I went through each strand of hair, cleaning up the blend and strengthening that highlight for a nice pop of color that would make any L'Oreal shampoo commercial jealous. It was at this time that UPS showed up and entered my office, surprising me, which led me to drop the model, breaking her right air.
Why, God?
I searched and searched, but was only able to find 2 of the 3 missing pieces, so I cried into my carpet and filled the gap with milliput to hide my crimes. Onto the armor. I painted a few video game characters at this point, and it's always interesting to copy the color scheme of another artist. The majority of Xal'atath's armor is gray, which initially I thought was a little lame. To spice it up, I mixed gray by adding off-white yellow into my black, which resulted in a warm gray to contrast slightly with the purple of the model. Yellow is the hue contrast of purple. Much like the other parts, I slapped on some quick and fast wet blends, but smoothing these blends out is going to follow a different tact. I could level the character from 1 to 80 faster than it would take me to clean up the blends on all these gigantic, smooth, featureless panels with a brush, so we're not gonna do that. With that rough, wet blend complete, I busted out some masking putty and covered up that precious face so I could do some airbrushing. With basically the same colors that I was mixing on my wet palette, I proceeded to soften the harsher brush strokes with an airbrush. I began with the brightest color and worked down to the darkest color. I find that working light to dark is best with an airbrush because highlights have a tendency to really take over. When employing this technique, I also find it's best to use diluted colors as you're just trying to smooth things out. Most of the work is done by the brush. With the putty removed, I was beginning to really understand the gray color choice. If you guys are enjoying me painting this display mini and you want to see more, I'll link a playlist below of all the videos of mine where I'm painting big, awesome figures. You can check them out after you finish this video. I then began the tedious job of base coating all the gold trim in a super dark purple color, as I plan to eventually shade that gold with purple. In the edit, this step goes rather quickly, but in real life, this took forever. The gold step was actually the longest part of the paint job. Lots of fiddly little parts. With the base coat complete, I began to highlight the trim. I started with my favorite gold color, Necro Gold, mixed with some of that same purple that I used to base coat the trim. I left behind some of that darker purple where I knew I wanted more intense shadows. I'm basically employing a method referred to as non-metallic metal, the art of using flat paint without the shimmering metallic bits to emulate a metallic look. But instead of using flat paints like they do in NMM, I'm using metallic paints. Plaints? Paints. I'm not redoing that line. I think this is a great way to get your feet wet with non-metallic metal, as the shiny metallic paints are a little bit more forgiving. With that first layer of highlight color done, I'm really starting to understand the gray now. The whole scheme, other than her skin, is fairly desaturated, which means her face draws a lot of attention. Next, I did another highlight, this time using pure Necro Gold, and then another highlight using an even brighter gold. I love these gold paints as they're very neutral in their hue, meaning they don't lean warm or cold. It allows me to mix weird colors into them without losing saturation, and some cool things happen as a result. With the second layer of highlight done, I broke out a magenta ink to smooth out my shadows, and quickly realized that the ink wasn't going to cut it, so I switched back to my original dark purple base coat for that job, which worked a lot better. It's much more opaque than ink and did the job much more quickly. After I smoothed out the shadows a bit, I then went back to the ink to add some interesting hues. When the purple ink covered up the gold, it created almost a copper that was really cool. I wasn't totally sure what was going to happen with this step. I thought maybe because gold is largely a yellow color that the purple would cause a muddy, nasty tone as it interacted with its hue contrast, but instead, something cool happened. I don't know about you guys, but I'm always experimenting when I paint miniatures, and I encourage you to as well. The process of discovery and exploration really helps to develop a personal style. With my shadows blocked in, I began to edge highlight the areas of trim where the shadow is strongest. This does several things. It lends definition to the model so that we can see where all the nice crispy edges are, and it reduces the shadow color overall by a slight amount, allowing gold to touch every part of the trim. Instead of having these subdivided parts of trim where other parts are dark and other parts are light, we have the two working together. Lastly, I did one final highlight in the most intense areas of gold and I was finished. Personally, I think this is one of my best true metallic metal paint jobs I've ever done, and I really like how that purple interacted with that gold that I'm using. Xalatath has a few gems littered around the model, and I started those with a base coat of that same deep violet color that I keep using. To kind of mix things up, I mixed magenta into this color to get my gem highlights that I applied sparingly to keep a lot of that dark purple color around. I kept mixing in more and more of that magenta, painting in smaller and smaller highlights. For my last specular highlights, I used some of that off-white blue from before to add little glossy dots. I also painted the gems with a gloss varnish to make them actually glossy. The very last thing will be to add some of Xalatath's Galaxy Balls. The concept we used to sculpt the model has these really cool orbs, and I wanted to add them to my mini. With some wooden spheres from a hobby store primed up, I began to sponge on a myriad of space colors. Really, I'm just lazy, and these were the paints that were already on my wet palette. I used a mixture of diluted colors to get a more foggy filter, and also undiluted paints to get more of a speckled appearance. This was fairly random. Some sepia and green could have also been good hues to add as well. When I was happy with my progress, I busted out a couple of inks. They were basically the same hue as the paints that I was sponging on, and began to soften some of the harsher edges and add swirls and lines. Again, there was little rhyme or reason to what I was doing. At this stage, I wasn't really sure if this was actually going to look good, but I had a few more tricks up my sleeve to save the day. To get some convincing stars, I flicked on some white ink. White ink is very thin, so it creates great speckles with the slightest flick, and now it's really starting to come together. My last step was to cover the orbs in a gloss varnish to up the saturation and make them look like glass. I wasn't overthinking it at this stage, and I simply superglued them onto her pointy shoulder armor. This is a display model, and it won't get jostled around or transported, so this should be fine. I stuck Xalatath onto a plinth, and that was this World of Warcraft miniature done and dusted. I can't overstate how incredibly honored I feel to be employed by Blizzard to make this model to celebrate the new expansion for World of Warcraft. It means so much to be given the creative license to a massive IP that I cherish deeply. To this day, my single greatest video game experience has come from playing World of Warcraft. I've never had more fun in my video gaming life than when I was playing 2v2 and 3v3 Arena. It was such a great form of PvP, and nothing has scratched that itch for me to date. To dial it back even further, I remember when I was playing my first ladder match of Reign of Chaos, and after I lost miserably, I went to my mother at the ripe age of 12, and I specifically remember telling her, "Mom, I found a new hobby." Blizzard was my introduction to modern gaming. I didn't grow up with a console like many of my friends, so my first real game was Warcraft 3, and it taught me so many things. I remember being terribly confused the first time I saw an XD emote in chat, wondering what the heck it meant. I remember the first time getting tricked into typing Alt-Q-Q on my keyboard after my enemy told me to push that button for hacks, only to find out that the hotkey made you quit the game, losing the match. Damn it! I've made in-game friends in WoW that then became long-term friends who even came to my wedding. I know I'm not alone in many of these discoveries and experiences. WoW has done a lot for a lot of people, and this expansion is the culmination of 20 years of adventure in World of Warcraft. Could it be time to fire up the sub again? That's gonna do it for this video, guys. Thank you again to Blizzard for entrusting your IP with me. It really means a lot. I can't overstate that. If you guys want to support the channel, there are a number of ways to do it. All things linked down in the description below. Most notably, I have a web store, Miniac.co, where you can pick up merch like a bunch of awesome t-shirts, but also hobby tools like a big cutting mat, double-sided Imperial grid on one side, metric on the other, cool art, 3mm thick, self-healing. You can also pick up a cool hobby brush box to store your brushes and other hobby tools. I also make my own miniatures, wood elves, and vampires. I also make masterclass courses for the paint jobs of those models. If you really want to deep dive into the art of miniature painting and get a lot of really nerdy detail, you can check out those courses. They're actually discounted when you buy them with the models. I also have a Patreon and Amazon affiliate codes and all kinds of things linked down in the description below. Subscribe or die! And most importantly, don't forget to...